Okay, recreating the IKFK switch. First of all, take your Maya and let's choose a particular camera. I like to do this from the top. So making sure your cursor is in the topmost of these four cameras, where the camera, you can tell the word top is here, ever so faintly. Front, side. Bring your cursor into the top camera plus the space bar. It should maximize that view. Then make sure that you are in the rigging mode for Maya and click on skeleton, create joints. And I just have kind of a default setup. Reset the tool. We're good. Best to bring up the outline at the same time. Make sure that we can all see what's going on. So I'm just going to create a basic chain here. And I'm going to put the slightest bend in it so that we can, for the IK handle, remember that Maya chooses which way that there's a slight bend in a joint. When you put an IK handle on it, it will bend in the way that the curvature is for this concave shape right here, meaning that this will bend in this direction, not backwards. Maya determines which way you want this to bend by seeing the initial bend and then just assuming that, well, this is the way this particular hinge joint should go. So you see it pop up here in the outliner. And the next step to do is to come up here and duplicate under Edit, or I like to use the hotkey, which is Control and D. I'll just Control D twice. And you can see that it's expanded to joints 1, 4, and 5. And if we hold down the Shift key and click on these little plus signs with the square in it, it will expand the full hierarchy of each of the joint systems. So in each one, I'd like you to go and select it, and let's decide which of these is going to be the IK, which is going to be the FK, and which is going to be the middle skeleton that adheres to both. And what I'd like to do for this case, just for organization's sake, is I'm going to choose the uppermost joint structure in the outliner and make it the leftmost corresponding joint system here. So all I'm doing is I'm just slightly rotating. In fact, we can make them all consistent. 30 degrees. I'll round up. And then this joint system, I will make it -30, and it should be equidistant from the middle. So I've got this joint 1, and I've got joint 5 on opposite ends of the joint 4. This is awfully confusing, just calling these all joint, 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 joint. So let's go to the top of the first one. I'm going to delineate this as the FK, and I'm going to say that this is the IK. Just pulled that out of a hat. So time to rename these so that I can keep that organization straight. So the thing I can do is come up here to modify. And you've got prefix hierarchy names. Whatever you type in here is going to be the prefix for the entire hierarchy of what you've selected, which is why I'm sure to grab the topmost joint. And in this case, I want to type in FK _, and it puts FK as a prefix for all the joints. And I come down here to layers, create layer from selected, double click on the name. It comes up as the edit layer, and I will rename it to FK _ layer. And I'm going to give this a nice sort of red color. Then the joints here, I'm going to make this the main skeleton. So I'm calling this prefix hierarchy skeleton _. And I then make a layer from that selected. Double click that. Skeleton _ layer. And I'm going to color that yellow. Just for clarity. You see how that kind of pops? We now have these things correctly named. I can make this disappear. I select FK joint. Sure that's selected here. And then I click off the corresponding layer. It disappears, validating that I have the correctly named joints in the correct layer. Doing this one at a time really also allows clarity, because if you rename all these and then you do all these layers, you can kind of get lost. So I'm just going through this one at a time and just renaming them so that I can maintain a clarity about what it is I'm doing. These are now the IK. I in turn come up here to the layers, create layer from selected, double click, coloring this blue, and I should have a series of bones They're all pretty much the same structure, only it's going to be red, yellow, blue, FK, skeleton, IK. So now what we have to do is we have to make this into a proper IK skeleton. And you do that by coming up here to skeleton, and you want to create IK handle. Now, there's a problem with this. If we create the IK handle, remember how we do that is we click here at the bottom of the root and then click up here at the top. Now, the problem is Maya could get very easily confused as to which of these joint structures I'm talking about. So if I click that, oops, it selected actually this bone structure. And I say, no, I want to click the blue one. So, well, once again, it defaults to this. So I'm going to ease this for myself and just turn off the other two layers so that they're invisible. Now I can kind of come up and with a lot more clarity say that I want to construct an IK handle. And I click on the bottom, and then I click at the very top joint, and it creates that IK handle. Remember that an IK handle now is something that you grab and you can translate down like so, and it takes care of all the IK for you. So let's get back to making these align to the two joints. Yes, I've actually messed this up. By the way, don't grab the effector. It's not the controller. You need to make sure you grab the IK handle. That's why the effector is actually turned off, visibility off, hide display on. Although in the outliner you can grab anything. Just make sure you grab the IK handle. You should see the whole thing lit up. You see the magenta coloring of this joint so that you can kind of push this around. I don't mind that I've messed this up because it's just going to give more clarity to when the skeleton adheres purely just to the IK. So how do we make this skeleton joint? In other words, this is going to be our final skeleton. How do we make it controlled occasionally by FK and occasionally by the IK? Well, how we do this is we add constraints. And the constraints start here at the top and go down to the next level of the bone and then finally to the root of the bone. And each of them will be assigned to orient itself to each of these bones equally. And then we will simply control the degree to which it is controlled by either joint system. Sometimes we want the skeleton to be IK, sometimes we want the skeleton to be pure FK. But first we have to take each section of these joints and assign them half of an influence from the top of the FK, half of an influence from the top of the IK, and then continue on down this ring so that this entire skeleton joint hierarchy, even though it's very simple, it's only kind of 3 bones, but this entire structure is controlled equally by FK and IK. And we do that by going through these systematically and making sure that we add a constraint to both of these controllers. And how we do that is very specific in Maya. So we want to grab the top of the FK joint and the top of the IK joint and say the top of the skeleton needs to align to both. And so to do that, we say, we click on the FK joint and then holding down the control key, click on the IK joint, again at the top of both of these hierarchies. And the last selection we need to make is that which is being controlled. And that's how Maya thinks about these operations. The order of selection in this is crucial. You are telling Maya, I want something to adhere to this, and you could select several other things. All we're interested in right now is 2. But the final selection is always that which will be controlled. So at this point, we've got the green selected, which is just the middle skeleton joint. If you're unsure which one you have, please validate it now. Stop the tutorial, take a look at your structure, and by using either visibility on and off, or by simply selecting them in the outliner, validate that you have the same structure. Because it is crucial not only the structure, but the order of operations in which we're doing this. So now with this selected, and in the proper order, we want to go to something called an orient constraint. It's under constrain, and it lives both in the rigging mode and in the animation mode. Got constraint here as well. So orientation is what we're off for. We just want to orient the rotation. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this now adheres equally to that and that. And we should see a slight, possibly a slight pop. But the other thing we're going to want to see is that the orient constraint that's created lives only in this skeleton hierarchy. So click apply, and there it is. Because we don't want to control the IK, we don't want to control the FK. We want this skeleton to automatically go between them. Okay? Now, I want to use the automated process of simply clicking my arrow keys to go down the hierarchies, since I have everything already selected in order. But notice it is not, it's not actually going down the hierarchy in the outliner. That's because it currently thinks I'm here still controlling orient constraint options, because the title is in black and this is grayed out. I'm in a bit of a quandary here, because the minute I click on one of these, I'm going to deselect the order here. Unless I click on the title. Watch what happens here. I left click on the title bar. Now, Maya knows that I'm dealing with this window, and it's kept all my selections. So I can simply press the down arrow on my keyboard, and everything goes down one step. And I hit another apply for the orient constraint to add a constraint for this, to go halfway between this FK and halfway between this IK. Now you should see this rotation shift slightly, because remember I bent this even more severely than how it originally was with the addition of an IK handle, and then I bent it over here. So this will be in an average rotation between this bone and that bone. So let's watch. That's exactly what it did. Also, I can validate that it added another joint constraint. And the third one I want to add is going down one more time with the arrow keys and saying I want to orient everything, including these little nodes at the top, which are kind of useless because there's not really a bone spreading off from them. But just to be consistent, we'll do that. And there we are. So now we have all the constraints necessary to get this rolling. And at this point, I suggest that you save as, and save your scene as IKFK switch _ constrained. Okay. So moving on, we now have for each of these skeleton joints a control. And really I can just put the template on these other layers, because the only one I'm really interested in working with at this point is just the skeleton layer. And notice that at every point of every joint that I select, this blue color means that this channel is now controlled by something, which makes sense because we've created constraints for each of the rotation values of these three joints. So there is, this is being controlled, this is being controlled, and this final joint is even being controlled by the rotation average of these other bones and their respective level in the hierarchy. All right, so how do we actually make the skeleton switch between the IK and the FK? Right now it's in perfect stasis between the two, because every time I select these constraints here in the outliner, I can see their values here. This means that it is constrained to the FK joint at a value of 1, and yet it's also constrained to the IK joint at a value of 1. So really it's beholden to neither. It's in perfect stasis between the two in an average amount of rotation between the two. How do we make it adhere to only one? Well, in this case, let's make it adhere just to the IK. To do that, I go to the FK for the value of this orient constraint, not the joint, the orient constraints. These are what I'm interested in. The joints are already being controlled, remember. So now we're going to make by hand this rotation value adhere totally to this constraint and not at all to this constraint. And we do that by messing with the setup here for that constraint where it says my percentage is 1%, well not percent, but I have the same number at 100% between these two. However, if I type in 0, it's now going to be controlled by just the IK rotation. And when we go down that chain, it becomes a little more obvious. What happens? Look what happens when I type in a value for 0. It lines up perfectly with this. Why? because I've said I want you, this constraint, to line up totally at a value of 1, which is effectively 100%, with this corresponding rotation of the IK joint. Notice it is not the exact same rotation because you have different rotation values between this. You have different rotation values between the IK skeleton here and the skeleton. Those are different rotation values. It's actually lining up the bone in the same way. Even though this curvature is not the same, it's lining the bone up. That's all we asked it to do. I want you to adhere this bone exactly in the same orientation as this bone. Well, it's done exactly that. In fact, if we go down to the very bottom, the last part, and we type in FK 0%, IK 1%, it's going to snap exactly here. So now we've put a 100% copy value on each of the levels of this particular joint. All right, so now we're going to start adding a control, and I suggest you can save again if you want to. It's crucial to constantly save. Go up to Create NURBS Primitives, not polygons, but NURBS Primitives, and come down to Circle. This will be our controller. Now, a couple of things here. First of all, this controller is going to be like an IK, is going to be like a constraint system on a rig. And the reason we made it a NURBS curve is because we want to give that its own layer. Select it. And we need to kind of see that it's very different from the rest of the joint structure. We need to kind of have it off on the side, saying that this is the controller and the bones are the things that are controlled. So constraint underscore layer, and I'm going to color this magenta just because it really kind of makes everything visually different. Okay, the thing we are going to deal now with is channels. Remember that every one of these bones has channels. Translate, rotate, scale. Everything has that translate, rotate, scale, including the NURBS. We're taking things that can be animated, and we actually want to get rid of some of the channels because we don't want people accidentally giving this keyframes. So let's say that we're never going to use visibility. We're never going to use scaling. In fact, it's dangerous. Someone could just accidentally come in here and type in visibility off, and we don't know where it is, and it's kind of freaking people out. So really, we don't have a use for these channels. Well, the way to do that is come up to the General Editors and go down to Channel Control. Channel Control shows you everything available here on the leftmost column for this item to be animated. However, notice that there's two more sections for different channels. One is non-keyable and hidden, meaning we just don't show it to the user, and it's not available to be keyed. Look at all these values that Maya normally hides that are inherent in all these different objects. So in this case, we want to add to it. So let's go with scale and rotate. Move. Let's add visibility. Move. All right, fine. And now with this selected, we can come up to Edit. And now we want to add an attribute. And this adding of an attribute means the translation values are already come default with any object that you read into Maya, as are the rotation values and the scaling values. However, we want to make something special. We want to make a new channel that is custom for our purposes. And that attribute is called IKFK underscore switch. So this will be the IKFK switch. It will be keyable. This again is pretty much the default setup that you get. And the minimum value in here is going to be 0. The maximum is going to be 10. Does it have to be those values? No. But I do want a finite range of possibilities because I want this to vacillate only between being controlled totally by the IK or totally by the FK. I really don't have a use for anything beyond that or less than that. So a -1 is useless to me, and anything past 11 although this one goes to 11, is totally useless to me as well. So I'm going to say OK, and I now have the IK-FK switch. If you click in here, you can type in 10. You can click in here and type in 0. You can click in here and try typing in a larger value, and it won't take it. So now this is perfectly truncated to our needs as a dial that goes from 0 to 10. In fact, when you click, of course, on the name of any of these switches, you can come into the Maya modeling window, hold down your middle mouse key, and your cursor changes to a left-right slider. And as you move it left, you'll see the value change in the switcher. And then you'll see it increase as you move it right. And that's how we're going to kind of slowly slide this back and forth, again, as a dial. Or it can be something that you simply type in 0, 10, or 5, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up so that if it's 10, it's controlled by the IK. Now we've currently set up the constraints so that they are controlled by the IK. We did that by hand when we took all these and took off any numerical value of the influence from the FK chain. So each of these constraints is 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, right here. And that's what makes the skeleton pop just 100% to the IK. In fact, if I grab this IK handle and move it around, I'm actually moving both of these skeletons. In fact, I'll come in here and turn off the IK layer, turn off the skeleton layer. So this is the IK layer. I'm turning it off. Here's the skeleton layer. It looks, wow, that's controlling it. Great. So that's already working. But I got to tell Maya, look, here's the deal. Whenever the IK-FK switch is at 10, I want these orient constraints to do exactly what I've set up. In other words, go 100% with the IK value. And then when it's at 0, I want it to be 100% with the FK value. And we do that with the clever use of something in Maya called set-driven key. And it lives under the key menu under animation. So key, set-driven key, and then go to set. So here's what you get with set-driven key. You get two windows. One says, what is the controller, please? And the second is, what am I controlling? In this case, driver and driven. Well, we know what the driver is. It's going to be this control that we've just made. And we've given it an extra channel called IK-FK switch. So we want to be sure that we load in the driver. Make sure that's exactly what you load in. And down here, we want to load in these three constraint systems as the driven. Click. Make sure your stuff, all your same window looks the same as this. Okay? So in these values, Maya now wants to know exactly what you mean. Again, it's very explicit. Okay, you have NURB circle, but what value in this is controlling what value in something else? Well, we've grabbed these constraints, not the joints, but the constraints, and load the driven. We want to connect them in the NURB circle, IK-FK switch, to each of these values, the constraints for each of the orient constraints, the constraint values for these orient constraints. So in each case, since this is already set at 10, and I've already set the constraints to be 100% controlled by the IK chain, I'm basically telling Maya, look, whenever this value that I've put in this driver, whenever it's at 10, connect that to exactly the values I have for these constraint percentages. So I'm going to click key, and it's going to now color this magenta, which is just coloring the skeleton. I'm going to hide everything else. It's just coloring this skeleton joint system from the top, and it should now add one to this joint as well. Key, and it did. Down to the last, the root orient key. All right, so we've done half the work now. Okay, now it's time for the second half, which is that we have to find a way to get that skeleton now to go 100% with the FK hierarchy, bone hierarchy. And we do this by clicking the visibility back on the constraint layer, selecting it, and by hand, instead of at 10, making this pop over to 0, not 100, 0. Okay, and at 0, now I have to come in here to each of these constraints, and instead of the values we did put in previously of 0, 1, we have to type in the opposite, which is 1, 0. And for the observant, you can see that what we're doing here is FK now is 1, IK is 0, so it's going to constrain itself to the orientation of the FK bones one at a time. And I don't even need to see it at this point. I can bring it back now with the visibility. And there it is, pretty much right on top of the FK bones as well. I'll bring in the IKs also. So I'm going to go down this and key, move up the joint, the orient constraints on the joint orient constraints, and just key them. Because we reset this value at 10, and then we canoodled all these to be 100% in the favor of the IK bone structure. Now we've done the opposite. We've come up here and changed the IK switch to 0, and we've canoodled all these orientation constraints to be 100% affected by the FK hierarchy. What we have done is basically this. We've told Maya, look, when this control has this value, line up to this bone. When this control has the 0 value, have the skeleton line up to this one instead. We've finished. Now let's test it out. Click on the name, come in here to your 3D modeling window, hold down the middle mouse key, and scrub slowly back and forth. See that? So now this is at 8.3, almost 100% to the IK, but it should be constrained totally by either 0% or 100%, depending on whether it's at 10 or 0. So these are all relative values for the constraint system, and it continues to adhere to it even when I grab the IK handle and I'm messing with this, because this middle skeleton is still in an aggregate rotation between these two other skeletons. So really what you're looking at in a rig is, chances are you're not looking at these controlling skeletons at all. They're hidden. All you see is this skeleton layer and the constraint. You say, oh, I need to switch between IK, and FK, and it's doing it automatically. But in fact, what it's doing is moving and shifting between two existing bone structures that are clones of that arm or that leg, allowing you to do both FK and IK animation in the same rig setup.